The British Museum is most celebrated for its rich collections of artifacts from early civilizations in its galleries. Here are the great creations of ancient Greece and Rome and Egypt. Away from the glare of the limelight is the print room, where some of the museum's finest drawings and prints are kept. And one of the print room's most peerless pictures depicts a lumbering, clumsy Asian animal. This depiction of an Indian rhinoceros has become one of the great popular images of European art.
I'm sure if we had 100 best images of European history, this one is the granddaddy.
I mean, it's full of life, and you can see its sort of sullen, irritable, bellicose nature. It's an image that lingers in the mind in the way that no other does.
Wherever we look, we find something new, and looking at the rhinoceros is looking at like a landscape, an endless source of pleasure.
Not the least part of its significance lies in its being one of the early mass-produced images in Europe.
It's not alone. It sits amongst a multiplicity of images of itself, if you like, and that's perhaps what makes it so powerful.
But where the masterpiece is not in this print in that gallery or that print in another one. It's in the way that the image has lodged in our minds. It is that quality of fantasy which makes it so intensely memorable.
The first rhinoceros since antiquity to reach Europe alive was sent from Gujarat in India. It arrived in Lisbon in May 1515. The exotic creature was a gift from the Portuguese governor of India to his king, Manuel I. News that a strange, even bizarre beast had arrived in Portugal rapidly spread across Europe. Soon the intelligence reached Nuremberg in Bavaria, the home city of the German master artist Albrecht Durer. A man always in search of new creatures to draw, he appears to have been electrified by the sensational appearance in Europe of a greater one-horned rhinoceros. Durer is believed to have first heard about the animal from a Moravian printer, one Valentin Fernandez, who had actually seen the beast. Durer probably received a rough sketch and description made by Fernandez. Using these, he designed in ink on paper his own representation of an Indian rhinoceros. It was this drawing that became his master template. The master drawing itself is in the print room, and it is plain to see that Durer's design doesn't look entirely like the real thing.
I think Durer probably did his best to depict the rhinoceros as he thought it really was. And the fact that there's a curious second horn on the animal's back, I don't think he added that second horn because it made the animal look more attractive or more interesting. I think Durer put it there because he thought it was there.
When the verbal description says this rhinoceros had scales on it, he goes off and does scales, even though rhinoceroses don't have scales. When it describes it as looking like a tortoise, that's a fairly good eyewitness description, but in fact, of course, it doesn't have a shell, it has skin. These are the reasons why Durer's iconic rhinoceros doesn't look terribly like a real one.
It was quite unusual for Durer to draw or paint an animal he hadn't actually seen with his own eyes. In fact, it is partly on his realistic nature studies produced from first-hand observation that his great reputation rests.
He was somebody who, almost more than any other artist, was apt to really observe the way things look, to become completely fascinated by the way everything looks. We know, for example, that when Durer saw a real lion, he revised his previous representations of lions. So he's very intent on fixing something once he knows what the real thing looks like. I'm sure if he had seen a rhinoceros, or if he had had more visual information, he would have instantly launched a new and corrected rhinoceros.
Durer's study of the natural world and its diversity was a lifelong obsession. He drew constantly in sketchbooks, leaving well over 1,000 drawings to posterity. The early 16th century was an age of discovery. Columbus had just landed in the Americas, and treasures from all over the world were emerging into the European light. At this period, that which was anomalous and freakish was celebrated. Artists of the Northern Renaissance found the unusual worthy of interest and study.
In this period, when a rhinoceros would have been discovered and its image proliferated, it would have been received by a culture hungry for curiosity. And in German, the word for curiosity is Neugier, which means, literally translated, would be lust for the new. And Durer was a quintessentially curious person. He immediately latches onto the rhinoceros, just as he does other novelties like the fabulous pig or the miraculous twins he does also, because he knows this is going to be a novelty, people are interested in novelty, and I am going to do a new kind of image.
The public appetite for the unusual, the bizarre, the freaky, that's something that's always been with us. Some tabloid newspaper reports today reflect exactly the same public appetite. We haven't changed.
Look at our obsession with the Loch Ness Monster. Any slightly unusual sighting or unusual creature which could appear, the rhinoceros clearly fits into that category.
This supreme master of the Northern Renaissance had an ingrained commercial instinct. He drew what would sell. His staple fare contained mostly religious images, the traditional subject matter for the audience of the late Middle Ages.
His important prints to him, like the Melancholia, Night, Death and the Devil, and his series of religious prints, the Apocalypse, the Life of the Virgin, and the Large Passion, these were his bread and butter. In his, if you like, portfolio of offerings, the rhinoceros is not so much a one-off, but a sideline. This isn't a private kind of, let me explore this for my own inner satisfaction. He knows there's a demand for this. He knows there's a market for this. He's going to make money out of it.
He's utilizing the new information about this fabulous beast in order to produce an image which will allow him to be the person who profits from its novelty. So in that sense, the rhino becomes an excuse for people to buy Albrecht Durer.
His rhino woodcut has become an iconic animal image. This wasn't just because it was an exotic beast designed by Durer, but because he chose to produce this image not as a painting, but as a print. He was the first artist to buy a printing press and set himself up primarily as a printmaker. This afforded him an unrivaled level of independence and creative control. A monopoly on all aspects of production also offered the promise of financial security that painting couldn't provide.
If you're a painter, you have to wait for the commission to come along. It does pay a lot more when you produce it, but it takes much, much longer to produce it. Whereas if you've got your stock of prints, you have a regular flow of income at regular times of the year. So in the end, it keeps you from a more precarious existence. He wasn't to know when he started his career that he was to become as famous as he did become as a printmaker.
It was a mass market medium. You could set up a mass production run of these prints and produce thousands of them. But these were certainly popular disposable prints. And this rhino was the current day's news.
There was pressure to capitalize on the Lisbon rhino while the news was fresh. Even in the 16th century, novelty had a shelf life, and Durer wanted the artistic scoop.
There was clearly a race on to produce the first image. It certainly appears to me from the drawing, which is a very quick sketch, that he was very anxious to get this image out and off the press as quickly as possible. And he wants to ensure that people know it comes from him. I did it first.
Working from his initial drawing, Durer would have drawn directly onto a block of fruit wood. The design was then cut, leaving the areas to be printed standing up proud in relief. Unlike engravings that were completed from start to finish by the artist, the production of woodcuts was a collaborative effort.
He would have made the drawing, and then that would have been transferred to the block and then passed down the workbench. There were people who were called formschneiders, block cutters, and they were the craftsmen in Dürer's workshop.
The woodcutters who cut the blocks, I think, are very often the unsung heroes in the production of these major pieces of woodcut technique. You had to have the skill of knowing which knife to use, what kind of wood you were going to use, just how your pattern was going to be conveyed.
If you think that because Dürer handed it over to his workshop to actually do the work, and therefore it's a lesser piece than if he'd done the whole thing himself, I think you're misunderstanding the nature of printmaking at that time. It was a collaborative process. It was a workshop trade. That doesn't detract from Dürer's achievement at all, because he was the mastermind behind this large enterprise. He was the ideas man and the designer.
The block would then be inked and put through the press. From that block, the process could then be repeated almost endlessly. The finished print would appear on paper as the mirror image of the design on the wood block. It's probable that Dürer would have taken about 10 days to produce his finished rhinoceros, from the initial preparatory drawing all the way to the finished woodcut print. Producing paper prints from a carved woodblock was the quickest printing method available to Dürer. But in spite of his efforts, he was not the only artist to produce a print of the rare Indian rhino, and possibly not even the first. A rival artist, Hans Birkmeyer, published a print of the rhinoceros in nearby Augsburg in the same year, 1515. Only a single print of Birkmeyer's rhino survived. It was Dürer's that was endlessly reprinted and remembered. He effectively flooded the market, but his design's enduring appeal over Birkmeyer's more naturalistic version was not simply due to weight of numbers.
One of the interesting questions for me is, are people buying this print because it's a print of a rhinoceros? Or are they buying it because it's a print of a rhinoceros by Albrecht Durer?
Dürer was already a very prestigious artist in this period. He would have considered by far the great German painter. It is, in terms of craft, far more compelling of an image, but it is also the fact of Dürer's authorship, which certainly gave it authority.
The gamble that Dürer took by concentrating on print rather than painting paid off handsomely. His Lisbon rhinoceros sold in thousands. Some 4,000 to 5,000 were probably printed in Dürer's lifetime. They were affordable art objects.
He wanted his art to be constantly available to everybody. And what better way to make it constantly available than a print, which is cheap to buy. A woodcut like this costs probably about not quite a sausage like some of the cheaper prints might have cost, but maybe more like the equivalent of a steak dinner.
So what's wonderful about the Lisbon Rhino is that it starts off as the gift of a sultan, it becomes the gift of a king to a pope, and yet here it is in a print which can be owned by a tailor, by a baker, by a notary, by a lawyer. Anyone who can afford to buy one of these can have their own rhinoceros on their wall or in their album. I mean, what more do you want?
By specializing in high-quality prints, Dürer not only achieved financial success, but took on an aesthetic challenge. Woodblock printing had long existed in Germany by this time, but it had been previously used largely in book illustrations for a semi-literate society. It was seen more as a craft technique rather than a process that could produce art.
Dürer said, this is not just any anonymous, not very good woodcut. I'm going to take this medium and push it further so that by the end of his life, quite a long time after the rhinoceros, he is making woodcuts of a tonal complexity to rival paintings.
He was much admired during his time for doing in black and white what artists did in colour. This is a very unusual talent. Most artists simply didn't have the time or the patience to draw something so accurately that they would get this very subtle and artistic shades of nuance on a print.
What you see in this rhinoceros is a greater finesse in the cutting of the block, the amount of detail, the amount of shading, the amount of overlap, cross-hatching, all that drawing detail, which wouldn't have been so fine in previous work.
The rhinoceros was a showpiece, a masterclass in what was achievable. Faced only with limited information about his subject, Durer had to use an amount of creative license. He borrowed heavily from other animals.
He was very familiar with dogs, horses and cows, so he's implanted a bit what he enjoys and what he knows about an animal, I think particularly in the ears and in the whiskers under the chin. He obviously didn't know where he was going with the eye. It looks like a human eye with various rows of eyelashes and bits underneath. And it looks quite kindly, which isn't quite right for a rhinoceros. But that's where, invention takes over.
The most imaginative feature of Durer's rhinoceros is the distinctive armour-plating design of the animal's form. Nuremberg was the centre of metalwork in Germany, and Durer, himself the son of a goldsmith, lived near the armourer's quarter.
It does look armour-plated. It has big pleats in its skin, and the parallel with human armour must have certainly occurred to him. He hadn't seen the animal, he'd only seen the drawing. It seemed to have armour. Well, let's give it armour with knobs on.
The overall effect is really of an armoured tank. It moves forward with terribly spiky, sharp points on it. The power and the frightening appearance of the rhinoceros, I think, is conveyed incredibly well by squashing a huge animal into actually quite a small woodcut. By having this huge odd horn touching the edge of the block, it's as though he's boxed in a cage.
He also accompanied his print with a detailed inscription in the vernacular German.
His form here is represented. It has the colour of a speckled tortoise and is covered with thick scales. It's like an elephant in size, but lower on its legs and almost invulnerable. It's also said that it's fast, lively, and cunning. It's actually an extremely good description of its form, about the size of an elephant but with shorter legs.
The inscription also mentions the aggressive nature of the rhinoceros in the wild.
The stupid animal is the elephant's deadly enemy. The elephant is frightened of it, as when they meet, it runs with its head down between its front legs and gores the stomach of the elephant and throttles it. The notion that it's continually fighting with elephants seems to me odd, because you can often see them grazing alongside one another. And they really don't fear anything much. An adult rhino really has hardly any enemies at all. But they are nonetheless surprisingly belligerent. It certainly does charge with its head down, as I know to my cost. I mean, I've had a rhinoceros burst out of the bush and charge a Land Rover with his head down, stick his head underneath the tailboard and lift the whole thing up and shake it. The moral is that if you find yourself in the presence of an Indian rhinoceros, stay still if you possibly can and hope that it's going to go away.
Durer's rhinoceros was so popular that it's estimated that about 12 to 15,000 were printed over time from the original block. There were no less than 8 separate editions. The British Museum holds in its collection several original Durer woodblocks, but not that of the rhinoceros. No one knows exactly what happened to it, but very probably it disintegrated in the 18th century.
By the time the 1620 edition came up, the block was in really quite a bad way. It was cracked and bits had come off it. But at that point, the work would have been well known as well by copies. The design, the image perpetuates in that sense, not from the block itself.
Durer's woodcut of the Lisbon rhinoceros bears the unmistakable hallmark of a Durer image, the distinctive AD initials of his monogram.
He was an obsessive signer of everything he made, more than any other artist really till the 19th century. Almost every drawing he made contains his signature. Every scrap of paper that he wrote on has his name on it. So he's very, very insistent that everything he makes proclaims that he made it.
As the rhinoceros print was disseminated en masse across Europe, no one who saw it was in any doubt as to who created it. Having a logo was no safeguard, however. Durer's was endlessly copied and reinterpreted by other artists, and he was forced to defend his name in a landmark court case.
People felt that it was fair game to actually take an artist's work and reuse it, especially if it was a print. Prints were actually meant to be kind of abused and used. So he went against the tide, really, there by saying, no, you can't do that. That's actually uniquely mine. You should buy mine, not buy the guy who copied it down the road. It's quite arrogant and quite egotistical, but absolutely very understandable to us in modern terms.
When he wins his lawsuit, he's not given control over the images he produced, but only over his monogram there. So it's his name that he owns, not the images he produces.
Long after more accurate depictions of the rhinoceros appeared in Europe, Durer's fantastical design continued to hold a fierce grip on how the animal was perceived.
The rhinoceros had a huge afterlife. It shows up in porcelain, it shows up in fabrics, it shows up in other people's paintings. It becomes the iconic image of the rhinoceros, even long after people had worked out that they didn't have these funny little extra horns on their back.
In 1685, another rhinoceros toured Europe and came to London. Francis Barlow, an animal artist, produced what he claimed to be a true representation of the beast.
But if you actually look, he's just lifted Durer's rhinoceros, adapted it, and stuck it into his own work. Well, what's going on? I mean, in part, it could simply be laziness. You have the image, it's reproducible, and you just reproduce it. We know that this is a rhinoceros, even if it isn't. And it's hard to let go of that sort of symbolic value.
Durer's stylized version of the animal held fast as the archetypal rhinoceros, in spite of several other attempts to challenge it.
Durer's drawing was the basis for a representation of a rhinoceros in all the great natural history works that followed. There is this wonderful picture which conveys a reality, even if you didn't know what the rhinoceros was like. I mean, it's full of life, and you can see its sort of sullen, irritable, bellicose nature, in the drawing. So what else do you do? Here's the best. This is the best drawing. Why would you go somewhere else?
A series of illustrations by James Parsons in 1743 finally broke the dominance of Durer's design. The visit to Europe of an Indian rhino known as Clara once and for all settled the argument over the animal's true appearance. She survived in captivity for 17 years and was immortalized by the leading artists of the day.
Almost all the rhinos that are actually depicted, they're all stationary. They're all standing there rather sadly. I know, of course, that's probably how they were when they were in captivity. The DeLonghi rhino is standing there without his horn, and he looks like a kind of real lost sheep.
I think Stubbs painted rhinoceros, and it's a kind of ploddy kind of thing. It doesn't have the vivacity and life and excitement and thrill of looking at Durer's rhinoceros. Durer, not being confused by the presence of the animal, is allowing his imagination to take over and thinking, what sort of a creature is this? And I will show it as this. And so that, to that extent, he wasn't hampered by reality.
Durer's rhinoceros continued to exert a powerful influence in spite of being discredited on a scientific level. The acquisition of prints in themselves became fashionable, and the rhino woodcut earned a place in private collections. Who made it was more important than what the print depicted. The first edition woodcut of Durer's rhinoceros joined the prints and drawings department at the British Museum in 1895 as a gift from William Mitchell, an obsessive collector of German prints.
Prints played a key part in the formation of the collection of a gentleman's cabinet. They went with the books, the curiosities. You had to have a good collection of prints. Durer's work played a focal position in that.
Despite being published on paper, many of Durer's rhinoceros prints survive in major European collections. It's impossible to say exactly how many have been preserved.
Several thousand are in existence, and they go through the sale rooms all the time, very beaten up impressions which, you know, don't cost very much. But one of this quality wouldn't come up very often at all, no.
The British Museum keeps a very good impression of the first edition of the print in its collection. It has become the benchmark to which all others are compared. The last pristine impression of the rhino print sold at auction in 1994 at Sotheby's for £111,000.
But today, a good impression of the rhinoceros, I would imagine, would go for quite a bit more.
Durer's woodcut immortalised the unfortunate animal that was brought from India in 1515. But what happened to the Lisbon rhino itself? The Portuguese king sent the creature by ship to Rome as a gift for the Medici Pope, Leo X.
The tragedy, of course, is that the ship sinks, and the rhinoceros, with its back legs chained, doesn't stand a chance. There are conflicting stories about what happens next. For some chroniclers, that's the end of the truly tragic tale of the Lisbon rhinoceros. Others, one Portuguese chronicler, suggests that the body of the rhinoceros was lifted out of the water, eviscerated and stuffed. Now, I personally don't think that would have happened because we would have had far more information about that stuffed rhinoceros.
The public has refused to supplant Durer's much-loved woodcut in its consciousness. The rhinoceros may not be Durer's most significant work, but it is one of his most enduring.
He worked very hard to raise the level of German art as we know it. That is what he wanted to be remembered for. That's what he would have liked to have been remembered for.
I don't think we should look at Durer's rhinoceros as a sort of charming foible of the Middle Ages. I think it's actually an extraordinarily powerful image in its own right still, even though it's not accurate. If you could find a perfect diagram of the rhinoceros, you know, it would do something different. It would be biology. But this is actually art.